Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Victor. With the rising tide of nationalism and fascism in politics, and with the iconic punching of neo-Nazi and overall horrible person Richard Spencer, the internet has been thrown into a new debate about hate speech and freedom of speech and where the line should be drawn. Should Richard Spencer, a man who nonchalantly calls for ethnical cleansing and who throws up the Hitler salute as if it were a good morning, deserve free speech? Is his right to hate speech legally defensible? I am here to explore that with you today. Political satirist and YouTube commentator Peter Coffin said that there are two kinds of people in this debate. Not die to defend the rights of the minorities he persecutes. White nationalism would not die to defend the rights of the people their hate speech is targeted at. This is because hate speech is dehumanizing rhetoric. And being dehumanizing, it necessarily implies that the people it's talking about are not people and are not entitled to basic human rights. What this means is that their rhetoric necessarily implies that they do not believe that these minorities deserve freedom of speech. And so we already have a theoretical limitation to freedom of speech located in hate speech. Hate speech is already inherently against free speech. But how does this translate into the real world? Well, what this begins to show us is that freedom of speech isn't free. And I don't mean this in a freedom isn't free, send our troops to the third world kind of way. When I say that freedom of speech isn't free, I mean that it is a consciously created institution that must be defended and must be consciously created to defend the right groups and paradoxically exclude certain groups. Why is the N-word unacceptable? Why are there some words our civilized societies just should not endure? It is because these words serve as a shorthand for historical and systemic oppression. When a white person uses the N-word targeted at a person of color, they don't just use a word unconsciously. They use that word and its association to the historic dehumanization and systemic oppression of people of color as an aggressive act. This means that hate speech is always a threat. It is always a limitant to people's rights to speak. It is always a limitant to their right to feel human. But how do we combat this in the practical world? Really, how do we combat this? Many legal scholars, most of which are naive and also white and privileged, will say that the solution to hate speech, of course, is more speech, counter speech, people speaking up for themselves. There are two things I believe are essentially flawed with this assumption. The first is that knowledge exists in a marketplace of ideas, a democratic marketplace where idea vendors can go to an idea stand and pitch an idea product to an idea consumer who chooses the best idea, and the worst ideas are discarded, as if it was a monetary transaction. What this dynamic ignores is that some people have more attractive stands at the marketplace, so to speak. People who have historically been privileged have more social capital to pitch their ideas to begin with, whereas minorities that have been historically oppressed do not have the same social capital, and their ideas aren't taken as seriously to begin with. So, at this first point, we see that counter-speech is already harder to work. It's already harder for you to talk up to free speech than to hate speech than it is for hate speech to talk down to you. The second assumption that these scholars make, which it has no epistemological backing, is that counter-speech happens. It doesn't. Scholar Laura New, I forgot her last name. You can ask me for that source. She actually went out and interviewed people from racial, ethnic, and sexual minorities to see whether counter speech was a reality. But unsurprisingly, when people were threatened with hate speech, when people were threatened with rhetoric that dehumanizes them, they did not talk back. The most common reactions were trying to laugh it off, trying to accept it, or running away. But in all of these three most popular reactions, counter-speech did not happen. What happened was a threat was made through hate speech and someone was silenced. Can we not see that this is already silencing? That hate speech in practice already limits the right to free speech of someone else? Well, this is my point precisely. If not counter-speech, how can we solve this? But First, I believe that this cycle of limiting counter-speech and limiting the voices of minorities creates a cycle of epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice is the term coined in 2007 by social scientist Miranda Fricker to denote injustices in the way that knowledge is created, passed down, and acquired by individuals. Her theories have been expanded by other scholars, but for our purposes, the epistemic injustices that happen here are this. When minorities are silenced constantly through hate speech and dehumanization, their voices are not added to mainstream narratives and academic knowledge. This is the first injustice. They do not have a voice to add their voice to the mainstream. But the constant bearing of that voice from mainstream narratives and academia means that when it is time for academia to understand and to teach these people about their identities, about their realities, academia simply lacks the language to express that. It simply lacks the language to express the identity and the experiences of oppressed groups. Aside from having horrendous implications such as oppressed groups not understanding their own oppression, not being able to form class and class consciousness and other consciousness about different vectors of oppression, it also stops the mainstream, more privileged audience from empathizing with them, from comprehending their side of things, and from seeing them as really other humans that we should protect. There are two historical examples of this that are very pressing to me. The first was during the Haitian Revolution, when slaves took up arms in a revolt and began to rule the island, began to rule Haiti by themselves. Meanwhile, whilst Haiti was a colony of France, France was losing its head over the revolution, and pardon the pun. And France, even the Jacobins, even the people in the Directory, the revolutionaries, they could not comprehend the emancipation of slavery. It was even though their whole shtick was freedom, equality, and liberty, they could not comprehend the freedom of slaves. This is because slaves had been historically kept from their Eurocentric and white-centric knowledge systems from putting their own perspectives. And so there was no way that, there was no language within academia at that time to express that slaves are people and people can rule themselves. More recently, we're seeing a very similar situation with trans rights. Trans rights matter, but most of the general population doesn't really understand what is at stake. They don't understand what are the problems at stake, what are the experiences at stake, because historically, trans people have been kept from explaining their own relationships with gender. They have been kept from explaining their own experiences and their own oppression. And this is something that ties back to, as with everything, ties back to colonialism and white supremacy and the suppression of indigenous gender identities, so on and so forth. And so when it came time for trans activism to go into the mainstream, most people did not understand what was it about? What did it mean to be a cis man, to be a trans man, to have a different relationship to gender? And in both cases, not understanding the other side, being kept from understanding the other side, really keeps people from seeing other people as human, from empathizing with them, from helping them function inside the democratic institutions. And so, whilst hate speech didn't create slavery, nor did it create transphobia, it is an essential step that keeps epistemic injustice in place and maintains this exclusion of minorities from knowledge and from mainstream narratives and academic knowledge. So, what is to be done? How can we solve this? The first thing that I think should become apparent is, upon a serious analysis of hate speech, we begin to comprehend the limitations of our freedom. we begin to comprehend that freedom of speech can't be something that you sit down on a chair and you say with you say, oh yes, I'm all for free speech. Say whatever you want. We're a democratic society, aren't we all? We aren't the Soviet Union. Just say whatever you want. But really, what should become apparent is that freedom of speech should be constructed. If there are groups that are going to use their freedom of speech to use hate speech and curb the freedom of speech of other people, those groups need to be stopped in some way, shape, or form. So, as paradoxically as it might sound, really comprehending and defending freedom of speech also encompasses choosing groups that should be limited from freedom of speech. I believe that practically there are 3 ways that we can remedy this. The first is public policy. There is rhetoric, there is certain dehumanizing things that should not be tolerated, even in a legal stance. The criminalization of homophobia, racism, transphobia is essential. The state needs to position itself in the position of the weakest entity. The second thing is, sometimes hate speech isn't something that is so deliberate. There is something called a dog whistle, which is when people use hate speech in a way that only other people who are more trained in that sort of hate speech can understand. And that can't be combated with policy, or else we're going to have the Committee for Un-American Activities all over again, and we don't want McCarthy again. I certainly don't. My point being, we need a mobilization of society. We need people to be able to say, no, this guy is saying things that are unacceptable, he needs to be deplatformed. YouTube, we don't want a neo-Nazi in your platform. PayPal, we can't allow neo-Nazis to move money and mobilize money in your platform. City Council, you cannot give a permit for neo-Nazis to just go and defend Confederate monuments whenever they want. But the most important thing, and the one that is more positive, that isn't excluding hateful groups from speech, is creating a safe space in academia and in society where minorities are comfortable, where minorities can actually engage in counter-speech. Because only when you can have people from their own standpoints defending themselves, we can begin to comprehend their positions. We can begin to humanize them, to engage with their ideas. It is easier for me as a cis man to defend trans people because I'm not systematically oppressed for being trans. It is easier for me to put myself in front of you all and defend people from racism because I'm not directly oppressed by that. But we need to create places where it's safe for people of color and for LGBT people to stand up for themselves. Only then can we begin to end the process of dehumanization. And so, I'd like to conclude that only by having a more serious and active involvement with the construction of free speech, and paradoxically deciding the groups that should be excluded, can we begin to combat hate speech and actually end the cycle of epistemic injustice that continues the cycle of systematic oppression. Thank you very much. I hope no one hates me.